Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Arizona State Office of Rural Health webinar series. Our State Office of Rural Health provides technical assistance to rural stakeholders to disseminate research findings, policy updates, best practices, and other rural health issues to statewide rural partners and stakeholders. This webinar is brought to you by the Arizona Center for Rural Health. Our mission is to improve the health and wellness of rural and underserved populations. This webinar was also made possible by our partners. Thank you to the Arizona Telemedicine Program and the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. As an attendee, your mic will be muted during the presentation. So if you have any questions, if you could please enter those into the chat box. There will be 10 minutes at the end for those questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted at these two links here, www.crh.arizona.edu and southwesttrc.org, in case you wanted to revisit this presentation later. Our speaker today is Haley Coles. She is the co-founder and executive director of Sonoran Prevention Works. She's a diehard Arizonan committed to achieving health equity among people impacted by drug use and drug policy. Her personal experience with chaotic drug use and the devastatingly preventable loss of people she loved informs her personal mission to make meaningful structural change for a more just and healthy Arizona. She is the vice chair of the Aunt Rita's Foundation Board, is an alumna of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Culture of Health Leaders program, received the 2018 Leadership and Advocacy Award from CABHP, and has provided consultation for the National Association of State and Territorial AIDS Directors and the CDC. Haley, welcome.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here with you all, and really grateful to the Center for Rural Health for asking me to be here to talk about stimulants. So I want to emphasize that this really is an overview. We've only got about an hour. When is this supposed to be over? Can anyone tell me?
An hour is correct, I think. Yeah.
An hour. Okay. So definitely would like to have some time at the end for questions, if there are any, but with an hour or less, I'm not going to be able to get into everything. And I really am going to be focusing more on the illicit stimulants because there's just less conversation about them and there's more stigma around illicit stimulants and illicit drugs in general. And in particular, rural communities have seen the impact of stimulants for a long time. Stimulants have been prevalent throughout the nation, but really particularly in rural communities. And now we are starting to see more harms related to stimulants transitioning over to urban communities as well. Next slide, please. So for anybody who doesn't know Sonoran Prevention Works, we are a statewide organization committed to making change for Arizonans who are impacted by drug use. Our mission is centering harm reduction in Arizona through participant-driven advocacy, education, and outreach. We do our work from the micro to the macro to have an impact on lots of different systems. So we operate a harm reduction outreach and peer support program, which currently we're in 5 counties, hopefully bumping it up to 6 in the next few months. We offer training and technical assistance for provider agencies and other community partners. And then we do advocacy to make legislative and regulatory change. And for anybody who is not aware, Senate Bill 1486 was just signed by the governor, which legalizes fentanyl test strips. So very excited about that. Next slide, please. So the learning objectives for today's presentation is that you all will understand the effects of stimulants, articulate some of the reasons why people use stimulants, and take away at least tools to be able to meaningfully support people who use stimulants, whether in your personal or professional lives. Next slide. So this concept of drug set and setting is really, really important when we're talking about drug use in general, but particularly so with stimulants. The impacts of stimulants vary widely when compared to other substances, and the drug, the set, and the setting tend to have a really significant impact on the person's experience, more so than with drugs like opioids. So this is a concept that was coined by Dr. Norman Zinberg in the 80s, and it makes a lot of sense. So we've got the drug at the top. So when we're thinking about the risks or the benefits to somebody who is using drugs, and in this case, stimulants, we want to look at the dose that they're taking, the potency, how strong is it, what's it mixed with, how regularly are they taking the drug, and what's the type of drug. Is it crystal meth, or is it an Adderall pill that came from a pharmacy? Then we look at the set, which is really kind of the mindset. It's the person. So what is their motivation to take the drug? What is their relationship to the drug? What's their physiology? Do they have pre-existing medical or mental health conditions? What is the individual's unique characteristics? What makes that person who they are? And what are their ideas and beliefs in general? Kind of what's their personality. And then the setting is the setting that they are consuming the drug in, or that they are existing in after they've consumed the drug. So that also encompasses their support system, their culture, and their social dynamics. And so when we're gauging the benefits and the risks to somebody when using stimulants, we have to look at each side of this triangle. Okay, next slide. So, what are stimulants? Stimulants are widely used throughout the world and have historically been used for millennia. And many stimulants are actually legal in the US. Next slide. So, again, this is very, very broad overview. But the thing that all stimulants have in common is that they are central nervous system stimulants. Which means that they stimulate neural activity and bodily functions. They impact heart rate, blood pressure. They can increase cognition. So stimulants generally help people focus more, pay attention more, and they improve mood and energy. And these are the reasons why stimulants have been and continue to be used, both medicinally as well as recreationally, licitly and illicitly. So for as long as humans have existed, stimulants have been used, as I mentioned. Coca was and is still used by indigenous people in South America. And then ephedra has been used in ancient Chinese medicine. They have very mild effects on people and are generally used to help people stay awake, to help them feel a little bit better, used for altitude sickness. And in the late 19th century, between like 1850 and the end of the 19th century, is when we saw these common stimulants be isolated. So cocaine, amphetamine, and methamphetamine were all isolated. In 1912, MDMA was patented by the drug company Merck. And in 1914, cocaine was outlawed by the Harrison Narcotics Act, which also outlawed a lot of other drugs. But in the 1930s, a type of amphetamine known as benzedrine was given to soldiers by the Allies and the Axis. It was widely used among troops in World War II to keep them awake, to keep them alert. And it was found that after World War II, there was a lot of stimulant use because people were given it when they were in the military. So in 1957, benzedrine was banned, but before that, it was over the counter. People could buy it typically in an inhaler form. And with MDMA, so like I said, it was patented in 1912, but it wasn't until 1976 that the psychoactive effects of MDMA were discovered. And as we'll talk about, MDMA is kind of a unique stimulant because it also has hallucinogenic properties. And amphetamine and methamphetamine are still today prescribed, most commonly for narcolepsy, for ADD and ADHD, and for treating obesity. Okay, next slide. So this is one of my favorite games, and I hope that you all will play it. We'll just do it in the chat. But let's name that drug. So if you think you know what this drug is, in the chat, pop in the number, and let's say what you think it is. Okay, number 1, Elizabeth. All right, 2, we've got crystal meth. That is correct. Good job, April. Elizabeth says that number 1 is ecstasy. Yes, it is MDMA. Yep. How about 3, 4, 5? 4, coca. No, 4 is kind of a trick one. So we'll come back to that. Number 2, yep, it's crystal meth. 3 is Adderall, correct. And 5 is cocaine, and this is particularly crack cocaine. Yeah. So number 4 is caffeine. This is raw caffeine. And yep, Candace, great job. Don't know if you typed that in before or after I said it, but yes, that is caffeine. And important to think about, stimulants are not just illegal crystal meth. Stimulants are used widely. They come in varied forms, and most of us take a stimulant every single day. Okay, good job, guys. One other thing that's really important to note, which of these substances do you think, there's one of these is a Schedule 1 drug, which means that the FDA, the DEA say that it has no accepted medical use? There's only one. Put it in the chat. So we've got MDMA, we've got crystal meth, Adderall, caffeine, and cocaine. No guesses? Crystal meth? Wrong. All right, I won't drag this out. MDMA is the only one of these drugs that is considered by the DEA to have no accepted medical use. However, it is currently approved for use by the FDA for some PTSD breakthrough therapy. And then interestingly, we know that, so Schedule 2, so the rest of these are Schedule 2 minus caffeine. That's not a controlled substance. But methamphetamine, cocaine, Adderall, amphetamines generally are Schedule 2, which according to the DEA, they have high potential for abuse or misuse. But it's not saying that there is no accepted medical use for these. And as we know, they're all prescribed. So methamphetamine is prescribed in a medication called, what's it called? Dexo something. We'll get to that later. So next slide. I will also mention that that's not an exhaustive list of stimulants. There are other stimulants, but these are some of the ones that we're going to talk about today. So for all stimulants, whether they are legal or illegal, tend to have these benefits and risks. And the way I have it written out here is that the benefits kind of correlate with the risks. So stimulants, you have a reduced need to eat and drink, which can lead to dehydration. And you don't actually have a reduced need to eat, you just don't feel like you need to eat and drink. So that can lead to dehydration and malnutrition. Increased productivity, that's why it's prescribed a lot of times. That's why it was used in World War II. It can also lead to cardiovascular danger and heart attack. Neurotransmitters that can be released lead to feelings of well-being and happiness. That is also associated with really rough come downs and withdrawals. Some of these drugs are associated with serotonin depletion. So for days afterwards, maybe even a week, there's extreme depression as the brain is slowly replenishing its serotonin. There's increased libido with a lot of stimulants, particularly crystal meth. And we also see an increased correlation with STIs and HIV. Wakefulness can also be associated with sleep deprivation, and sleep deprivation is really one of the most common causes of so many of the dangers that we associate with stimulant use. And then increased energy. People might be up, dancing around, they're not drinking water, they might be in a hot space, and that can be associated with hyperthermia or overheating, which can be deadly. Okay, next slide. So that's just general stimulant stuff. Now we're going to talk about some specific drugs. Next slide. All right, so methamphetamine. On the left, we have a picture of crystallized methamphetamine, and that is what is made illicitly in labs. As I mentioned, so it's called desoxin. I might be saying that wrong, but desoxin is prescribed methamphetamine. I think the actual name for it is methamphetamine desoxin, but on the left is crystal methamphetamine. So meth as well as cocaine release quite a few neurotransmitters in the brain. So they release serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And so those lead to feelings of euphoria. It makes people feel really good. In addition to that, you've got the increased heart rate, you've got the increased blood pressure, and it leads to long periods of wakefulness, productivity, intense focus. Because meth lasts for 8 to 12 hours, there is very real risk, as I mentioned, of dehydration, serious sleep deprivation, and these symptoms are much more intense with meth specifically because of how long meth lasts in the body. So if a person does meth 3 times in a row, they could be up for 36 hours potentially. And I don't know about you all, but when I'm up for like 19 hours, I start seeing things. So that's significant. Also, because it lasts so long, it's not used as frequently as drugs like cocaine. Additionally, because it lasts so long, these long-term effects of dehydration, malnutrition, sleep deprivation can lead to what we see as irritability, aggression, decreased cognitive reasoning, loss of time and perception. So those aren't necessarily inherent to the drug itself. Those things happen when a person has not slept for a long time, hasn't been drinking water, hasn't been eating food. So meth can be administered in all the ways. So meth can be snorted, it can be smoked, injected, swallowed, and inserted anally, which is a good harm reduction tactic for people who inject because it's absorbed in a similar way without needing to use a needle. But we really commonly see the smoking of crystal meth because it has high bioavailability. It's instantly felt. The vapor goes into the lungs and is absorbed into the bloodstream. And it's easier and more accessible than injecting is. As I mentioned, it increases libido and it makes sex more enjoyable. So we see what's called party and play or chemsex pretty frequently among men who have sex with men who use crystal meth. A lot of times this is the only time that people are taking crystal meth is for sexual activities with self or with others. And this leads to extra safety concerns. As I mentioned, increased rates of STIs. When people are having sex for hours and hours, there's more fluid exchange, there's more blood exchange, and it increases the risk for STIs like HIV in particular. So this myth around meth now is important because, again, I'm a harm reductionist. I think everybody here is interested in humanizing people who use drugs, so we have to look at stigma. And there's a lot of stigma around what we call meth now. And it's real. Absolutely. There can be chemicals in meth, especially meth that is produced illicitly, crystal meth, that can be corrosive to the teeth. But same with cigarettes. Cigarettes can also be corrosive to the teeth. So what is it in particular about meth use that leads to this? It's dehydration. When people are really dehydrated, the mouth stops producing saliva. And when there's no saliva, it increases the potential for bacterial infection. Saliva is there to keep your mouth healthy. So that combined with loss of time perception, people forgetting to brush their teeth or maybe not having access to toothbrushes, that is what we see really contributing to meth mouth. So some things that we can do that are associated with harm reduction is encourage people to set alarms, to remind them to drink water, to brush their teeth. Also giving people sugar-free gum can help to generate some of that saliva. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to talk about cocaine. So similar to meth, releases those same neurotransmitters. One of the big differences is that it comes from the coca plant. So whereas meth is synthetic, cocaine is not. And another thing that's pretty different about it is that it lasts much less time. So the impact of cocaine will last between 15 and 60 minutes, but then the come down can last quite a bit longer. Routes of administration, so it's not really swallowed unless it's an amphetamine pill, but generally snorted, smoked, injected, or anally inserted. It is kind of a more mild stimulant effect than meth is. People who use it report feelings of alertness, energy, confidence, also anxiety, agitation, paranoia. It is a numbing agent, so there's numbness at the site of ingestion. So if a person injects it, that area is going to feel numb. If they snort it, the nose, the throat can feel numb. It doesn't last for too long, though. And it is still used as a numbing agent in some medical settings. What's interesting is that 14.4% of the American population aged 12 or older has reported using cocaine at least once in their lifetime. Whereas less than 1%, 0.7% of Americans 12 or older are current cocaine users. Only 0.3% meet the criteria for cocaine use disorder, and this is from the 2016 National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So we don't see cocaine use disorder happening super frequently among people who use it, but it is still real. So I want to talk about crack versus coke. There's been a lot of misinformation and really hysteria about crack over the years. There was really this panic in the 80s and 90s about crack. But crack and powder cocaine are the exact same thing. Crack cocaine just has something added to it. I don't remember what it is. It's like saline or something. It's not saline. I don't know what it is. It's not a chemical that impacts the brain, though. It just makes it smokable. It turns it into a rock that's kind of yellowish, powdery. And because it is smoked, whereas powder cocaine isn't really smoked, it hits the bloodstream faster than it does with injection. So because it hits the bloodstream faster, it also wears off faster. So we see more frequent or compulsive use with crack cocaine, and that is only because of how it's absorbed in the body and because it wears off faster. So crack is going to wear off after 15, 20 minutes, whereas powder cocaine is going to wear off after maybe 45 to 60 minutes. Crack is also cheaper. And approximately a quarter of cocaine users use crack. As I mentioned, this moral panic in the 80s was very much associated with anti-Blackness and with poverty. But Black and white drug users use crack cocaine at very similar rates. That's not actually based in reality. And you all may know that there is a sentencing disparity between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. So up until, I want to say, 2014, 15, around then, there was a 100-to-1 disparity. Somebody with 1 gram of crack cocaine would be sentenced the same amount as somebody with 100 grams of powder cocaine, even though they're the exact same drug. So if somebody has 1 gram of powder cocaine, they are not sentenced the same way as somebody with 1 gram of crack cocaine. That was changed several years ago, but there's still a disparity. It's now 18-to-1. And that's something really important to consider, and that really impacts people who use stimulants, in particular, who use crack cocaine. And so this myth of crack babies was also a part of this anti-Black, anti-poor bias narrative hysteria in the 80s. So studies have shown that exposure to either kind, crack or powder cocaine, can slow fetal growth when people use crack or powder cocaine when they're pregnant. However, it has been shown that the baby's body and brain development do catch up as they grow up. So there's not this long-term or permanent impact, and this idea that crack babies are like joyless, unreasonable, uncomfortable babies or children, that's also not based in science. What is shown to have long-term negative effects on the brain and bodily development of children is the harms and stresses of poverty. We know that prenatal exposure to that kind of stress does have more of an impact on the development of babies than prenatal cocaine exposure. So important to cut away that myth. Obviously, not necessarily a great idea for people to be using cocaine while pregnant, but let's talk about reality here. Okay, next slide, please. So MDMA so remember, this is the only one that's considered a class 1 scheduled drug. MDMA stands for, I'm going to say this very wrong, methyl-N-dioxymethamphetamine. If anybody knows how to pronounce that, I will give you a gold star. So that translates to MDMA. It impacts the neurotransmitters, but it really focuses on serotonin. So a lot of serotonin is released. And serotonin increases empathy for people. It reduces fear, and people feel, it increases feelings of connectedness. And it is being used in psychotherapy practices to this day. These other impacts of serotonin release are sensitivity to light, muscle tension, jaw clenching, faintness, chills, sweating, relaxation, openness, acceptance, that's the word. It does, though, temporarily inhibit serotonin reuptake. So I talked about that earlier. That is strongly associated with MDMA. So depletes the serotonin in the brain, takes days to come back. And cocaine, when cocaine is combined with antidepressants, we also see this serotonin depletion, also known as serotonin syndrome, happening. So it lasts for 3 to 6 hours, so it's between cocaine and meth. It is a stimulant as well as a psychedelic drug. So there are hallucinations that can be associated with MDMA. It is swallowed and snorted most commonly. Typically comes in a pill or powder. And it is generally used socially. So we think of MDMA, Molly, ecstasy as being used at raves, at parties, in social settings. And the effects produced by MDMA are stimulated by visuals, sounds, smells, touch. So it heightens the sensations for somebody. We see it, so Molly is kind of slang for MDMA, but Molly is typically drugs that contain MDMA, or maybe don't even contain MDMA, but are marketed as it, and diluted with adulterants. So the Molly market is actually one of the most adulterated markets in the world. It's really hard to know what is actually in Molly or ecstasy when you're buying it. Overdose is pretty rare with just pure MDMA. However, because it's often mixed with other substances, because people might be using additional substances in combination, that's when we can see overdoses or what's called overamping occur. The most common health problem associated with MDMA is both hyperthermia, which is overheating, and hyponatremia. I don't actually know how to say that. Hyponatremia, which is drinking too much water to try and compensate, because there is a lot of messaging around MDMA safety. Don't get dehydrated, drink water, but people overdo it with the water and it can dilute sodium in the bloodstream. It can actually be fatal. So we really encourage people to drink things like Gatorade, things that have electrolytes in them so that sodium doesn't get diluted in somebody's blood. About 7% of Americans have ever used MDMA in their lifetime. And there's a myth that it's not really a stimulant, but it absolutely is. Methamphetamine is the last part of the drug name. So I think that there's different stigma and different associations with MDMA as compared to drugs like meth and coke. But again, let's be real about what it is. It is a stimulant. It is a methamphetamine. Okay, next slide. So again, these are not all of the stimulants, but these are the ones that we're focusing on. And I do want to spend some time talking about bath salts. So bath salts are part of this broad category of drugs called synthetic cathinones. And synthetic cathinones are a type of novel synthetic psychoactive substance. So that's the overarching umbrella. That's also where we see fentanyl and fentanyl analogs coming down. So then we see synthetic cathinones, which are made to mimic a natural drug called khat, which is found, I believe, in East Asia. So these synthetic cathinones are considered to be euphoric stimulants. They don't last for very long, and they're similar to amphetamine. Rarely do people seek out synthetic cathinones on their own. Most often they are mixed into other drugs, especially Molly. And the risks are pretty similar. The risks associated with synthetic cathinones are similar to the risks associated with cocaine and amphetamines. We first started seeing these in the early 2000s in Europe, actually, and it was sold as methadone. It was sold in convenience stores, in bodegas, and around the same time, it started being sold in the US as bath salts. And it was actually a different type of drug. It's called MPDV, not even going to try and pronounce what that stands for. And it was sold as bath salt, or as plant food, or as cleaning products. And it often had these labels on it, like we see here, that says methadone not for human consumption, so that it could be, so it wouldn't be questioned as much when it was sold in convenience stores. Okay, I mentioned that it's often found in Molly, and the reason why these drugs became popular is because people were looking for legal alternatives to meth, to coke, to MDMA. And although these substances were legal, and some of them still are, they're not regulated. So same thing as with all other illicit substances, people don't know what's actually in them, and that's where a lot of the danger comes from. In 2011 and 2012, they were banned. So these synthetic cathinones, bath salts, were banned in the US, which just drove it underground, so it couldn't be sold in convenience stores anymore. And it was shifted to these illicit laboratories and being sold on the internet and through individual sellers. And synthetic cathinones appeal to people like folks who are in active military, athletes, people who are on parole, people who are being surveilled for drug use because they don't show up on standard drug tests and it's easier to avoid detection. We've also heard of Flocka, which was first emerged in the Southeast US. So Flocka is actually alpha PVP. There's not a lot known about it. Similarly, there's not a lot known about these drugs because of chemical prohibition. And because oftentimes the only time we see people who are being impacted by these synthetic cathinones when they show up to the emergency room. So an extremely rare side effect of synthetic cathinone use is what's called excited delirium. And this can actually happen with all psychostimulants. So it's not just synthetic cathinones, but there was a lot of media hysteria around bath salts in particular. So it's a combination of delirium, which can look like anxiety, hallucinations, disorientation, with elevated body temperature, more pain tolerance, and hyperaggression. So when we hear about Florida man eating somebody's face while on bath salts, that's not common. And I'm pretty sure it was shown that it wasn't bath salts in that person's system. But what's interesting about drug criminalization laws and how these laws or how these drugs are banned is that the chemicals themselves are banned. And so then manufacturers change the chemical structure just a little bit so that it can fly under the radar and not be considered illegal. And then the laws come in and they change they make those particular chemicals illegal, and then the chemicals change a little bit. That's what we're seeing with fentanyl analogs as well. And that these analogs, these novel synthetic drugs, are getting more and more dangerous and unpredictable. Okay, next slide, please. So overamping is kind of like a stimulant overdose, but it's really a broad term for when people use stimulants and just aren't feeling or aren't acting right, because many people take stimulants as prescribed, or they're taking them recreationally, and they sit and write a paper, or they fix a computer. But what we commonly associate with like kind of crazed stimulant use is oftentimes overamping. It has less to do with how much a person uses and more to do with their physical health, their mood, the setting. So really that drug setting is super important to preventing overamping. It has both physical as well as psychological impact. Next slide. So these are some of the physical symptoms, and the ones that are in bold are the ones that like are really, really dangerous and we see leading to death. But vomiting and dizziness, loss of consciousness, chest pain, that can lead to heart attack. That can be a symptom of oncoming heart attack. Overheating, like I talked about, hyperthermia, chills, difficulty speaking, that could be an oncoming stroke. Seizure, limb rigidity and cramping, or shortness of breath. And then on the psychological side, extreme anxiety or panic, paranoia, hallucinations. Other than with MDMA, hallucinations aren't associated with these other drugs. So if somebody has been taking these other drugs for a long time, they haven't slept in days, they haven't been eating and drinking water, there are other chemicals mixed into what they're taking, and we start seeing these hallucinations. Agitation, hypervigilance, and we can see psychotic episodes occurring. Okay, and it's important to teach people who use stimulants or people who are around folks who use stimulants how to recognize the signs of a stroke, cardiac arrest, overheating, what to do when somebody has a seizure. And we'll talk a little bit about de-escalation and calming people down shortly. Next slide. All right, so this is a harm reduction-based presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about what harm reduction is, and then go into some tangible ways that we can prevent harms and support people who use stimulants. Next slide. So harm reduction in general, it is a set of strategies, it's philosophies, it centers people who use drugs as more than their drug use and as experts on their own care. So we recognize that there is a wide continuum of experience with drugs and with drug use, and what works for some people doesn't work for others, whether we're talking about stopping using drugs or enjoying those drugs. Many people have many different experiences, and with harm reduction, we want to reduce the harms of somebody's drug use and really meet them where they're at. That's kind of the motto of harm reduction: meet people where they're at and support any positive change, because change doesn't happen overnight. Harm reduction also does not aim to minimize real harm related to substance use, and there should not be a dichotomy between harm reduction and recovery. First off, what do we mean when we say recovery? A lot of times people, when they say recovery, are talking about 100% abstinence. And so it's important to note, if we are talking about 100% abstinence, that we say that. The way that SAMHSA defines recovery and that others define recovery, the way that I personally define recovery is, do you have a sense of mental and emotional well-being? Are you able to show up for the things in your life that you want to show up for? Are you free from chaos? And we know it's not just drugs that cause chaos, right? It's abusive relationships can cause chaos. Poverty can cause chaos. So recovery is less about the drug itself and more about how is a person functioning? How are they showing up for the people around them? And harm reduction can be a stepping stone to abstinence. Harm reduction can also be somebody's recovery. Next slide. So I won't spend too much time here, but there are a few different theories of substance use and understanding substance use, and this is by no means not exhaustive, but there's this rational actor idea that people are just choosing to use drugs for no good reason, and if we punish them, they will stop. And sometimes people are using for no good reason, I guess. Yeah, if punishment and the threat of punishment worked, it might be for people who are just these rational actors. So then there's the disease model, which is that it's a chronic brain disease. People may never recover from substance use disorder. And we know that most people don't need treatment, and they can moderate again. There was a huge epidemiological study in 1997 that showed that the majority of people who struggled with substance use were successful without treatment. But of course, there are people who need treatment, and harm reduction does not minimize that at all. Harm reduction helps people get to treatment if that's what they want and that's what they need, and helps folks to overcome those barriers. And as we'll talk about, treatment for stimulant use disorder is not as cut and dry as it is for opioid use disorder. And a lot of times, I think in the field, whether in criminal justice settings or in drug treatment settings, we just assume that everybody has this substance use disorder, that everybody has the same thing going on in their brain. And that really prevents us from providing people with customized, personalized care, which is what is recommended by SAMHSA, that we provide person-first, customized care for people. So really important that not everybody who uses drugs, not everybody who uses stimulants, even if they are using illicit stimulants, they don't all necessarily have a stimulant use disorder. And it's important that we ask people what their relationship is to the drug and work with them to determine what kind of changes they want to make and how they can be healthier and safer. And then there's the biopsychosocial model, or the adaptive model, that takes into consideration a person's entire social, cultural, biological context. And I think that this is really, really important. Whereas with the rational actor and the disease model, we're saying there's something wrong with you. Whereas with the biopsychosocial model, we're saying there's something going on in your environment. There are probably a lot of different overlapping things happening in your environment that are causing you to use in the way that you're using. So like I said, this is not all of the models. It's confusing. These models are used interchangeably in a lot of settings. So the takeaway that I hope you all take from this is, don't pathologize people. Not everybody, and actually most people who use stimulants aren't broken and they don't need to be fixed. But just like every other person, we all need support. So let's find the ways that we can support people. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So next slide, please. So some tangible harm reduction strategies. Again, we've got to look at how people are ingesting the drug. And there are certain risks that are associated with those different forms of ingestion. So with injecting, we want people to use sterile, unused work. This can help to avoid things like HIV and hepatitis C, as well as abscess and other bacterial infections like endocarditis. When people are using stimulants in
Can you all hear me okay?
Yep, you're back. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So sorry. Hang on.
Is that better? Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, my phone just literally hung up on you all. Okay, thank you. So when people are injecting, they're typically aiming for a vein. And when people miss a shot, especially with meth, A, it really, really hurts if it doesn't go into the vein. But B, there are so many other chemicals in stimulants that it is a surefire way for people to get infections and abscesses. Also, if we're injecting, we want to be regularly getting screened for HIV and hepatitis C. It's recommended every 30 days for people who are actively injecting. Don't let others inject for you. So we do see this dynamic in relationships where in heterosexual relationships, the woman or just generally the more feminine person in the relationship can't always inject themselves, and so they're depending on somebody else to inject for them, and we start to see abuse and manipulation happening here, and especially if people are sharing only one syringe, the second person to get injected is getting whatever that first person has. Also, vein health is really, really important for people who are injecting. We want to teach people to rotate their veins, to not inject in the same place every time. Safer places to inject in, and then the difference between an artery, a nerve, and a vein. People can die if they inject into an artery, and a nerve can cause paralysis. And then also citric or ascorbic acid is used for dissolving crack cocaine because crack doesn't dissolve as well. And if people don't have access to citric or ascorbic acid, they might use things like vinegar or lemon juice, which can cause damage to the vein and to the skin, and can also increase the potential for bacterial infection. And so that's really specific to injection of crack cocaine. Next slide. So this is just a image of some of the real danger zones for injecting. And I want to be clear, there are no safe places to inject, but there is a hierarchy of safety. So we really want to discourage people from injecting into the neck, into their wrists, and into the groin. This can lead to things like collapsed veins, more infections, things like blood clots, which can travel to the heart. So that's important. Next slide. So a lot of stimulants can be used by smoking, and it's important to know what these supplies are, because by giving people access to smoking supplies, or at least telling them where they can get them, A, we can decrease injection for some people, and B, we can engage with people. So we know that harm reduction is a way to build relationships, but if all we're giving out are supplies that are specific to opioids, then we're missing that opportunity to engage with people who use stimulants. So again, we want people to be using things that are sterile and unused, because especially with the pipes, the lips can crack, they can bleed, and if people are then sharing, there's a possibility to transmit hepatitis C and HIV. So things like pipe covers can be used. If everyone has their own pipe cover, but there's only one pipe, then that can help to prevent some sharing of blood. And it can also prevent burning of the lips. We see some people making their own pipes out of pens, out of soda cans, and there are a lot of chemicals that are released with that. So the safer type of pipe to use is going to be made out of Pyrex. So people, when they're smoking crack, so this bottom kit is for crack, the top kit is for meth. When people are smoking crack, they need a filter. And some people will use what's that stuff called? Like metal, like the metal wool, steel wool, that's what it's called, steel wool. Really the best thing is brass screens. Yeah, steel wool, thank you. Because the heat can easily, steel wool will fall apart and dislodge, and then that burning metal will go back into somebody's throat or into their mouth, where brass screens don't dissolve as much. And then, of course, giving people chapstick and gum, as I mentioned, to help with the dehydration and to avoid some of the cracking and the burning. Next slide. So then snorting safety. Again, don't share. Their blood vessels can dilate and rupture when people are snorting chemicals, which then allows blood to come into contact with the snorting device. And if we're sharing, then we are sharing blood and potentially sharing infections. A lot of people use dollar bills because most people tend to have a dollar bill around them, but we don't know how many people have stuck that dollar bill up their nose or where that dollar bill has been. So again, we've got ruptured blood vessels in the nose. We don't want to be introducing bacteria and infections. So we can encourage people to carry around a pack of Post-it notes because in a pinch, they can make a tutor from Post-it notes. Or up in Seattle, they're actually giving away these plastic straws, and they're colorful so that people know what color is theirs and they're not sharing. We can encourage people to rinse their nostrils or snort a few drops of warm water. And people can use vitamin E oil inside the nostril to help with healing. Next slide. Okay, so as promised, some ways that we can help people de-escalate or kind of calm down when they're over-amping. And so a lot of this is addressing the psychological symptoms. We want to isolate people from noise and from groups. So say you work at a treatment center or a housing place, or you're out in the community doing outreach, take the person to a different room because all of that stimulation is going to make things worse. It can help if somebody has their back to the wall, so they're not concerned about who is coming in behind them, help them see the door and know that nobody's going to sneak up on them. Avoiding car rides. It's a lot of stimulation, and that typically doesn't help. Just a general location change can be helpful for people, as well as walking it off. So the heart rate, the body is moving, the blood is flowing throughout somebody's body, and just being able to walk that energy off can be helpful for some people. Having puzzles or fidget toys for somebody to focus all their energy on, as well as listening to calming music, putting on some headphones. And when people are overheating, sweating, we want to give them cool cloths, put those cool cloths on the back of their neck, on their forehead, put a fan in front of them, because we do not want hyperthermia to happen. Okay, next slide. Also, when people are overamped, we want to create safety because it can be really scary for people, especially if you've been up for days and you're starting to hallucinate and you're seeing things. So we want to validate somebody's experience. We always want to validate what they're going through without confirming necessarily that those hallucinations are real. So if y'all haven't taken mental health first aid training, I definitely recommend it. A lot of the recommendations for psychosis and hallucinations are absolutely applicable for people who are overamped on stimulants. We want to distract them as much as possible. So if somebody's got, somebody thinks that the government is listening in on their phone, we say, hey, I know that sometimes that does happen for people, and I know that you're experiencing that. I'm not sure if that's what's happening here, but let's just put the phone in a different room, and we don't have to worry about it right now. So distract them from the thing that they are fixated on if it's causing a lot of problems. We can name what's going on. You seem to be really upset right now. You seem to be pretty agitated. I've got some concerns. I'm worried. Can you sit down? It would make me feel more comfortable if we could both sit down together. And it is okay to set boundaries. So whether or not a person's on drugs, whether or not they're overamped, if people are acting in ways that make us unsafe, it is absolutely okay to say, hey, this behavior is not okay. I need you to leave and let's try again tomorrow. We never want to permanently kick people out of treatment or the space that they're in because we know that people change. Okay, next slide. So some other just general harm reduction for stimulants. So we talked about food and hydration. Sometimes it can be hard for people to eat. So at SPW, we give out food kits that contain bottles of Ensure. If somebody can just take an Ensure or a Boost, they can get some calories in them. And as I mentioned, water is nice, but electrolytes are usually more important and can be safer. Oral health, giving people toothbrushes, helping them set alarms to remember to brush their teeth, or alarms to remember to do anything, to eat, to drink water, to take their medications. Drug testing, so people being able to test for fentanyl because fentanyl is showing up in stimulants. But as I mentioned, especially in MDMA and Molly, there's all kinds of wild drugs being put in them. So there are actually testing reagent kits, which are more expensive than fentanyl testing, but they'll test for a broader range of substances. Naloxone, because people combine substances a lot, or maybe they're not meaning to use an opioid, but the opioid is mixed into their drugs. So no matter what people are using, they need to have naloxone on hand. Regular STI and hepatitis C screening, whether or not they're injecting, they may be having increased and more risky sex, as well as safer sex supplies. A lot of people may refuse to wear condoms, but if we give out lubrication, that can help to prevent some of that blood transmission. And then, as with all drugs, avoid mixing if possible. When people are mixing, they should use less of each substance, try to have more time between the use of each substance, and take it slow. Okay, next slide, and we're almost done, guys. So when people are reducing their stimulant use or stopping, we need to prepare them for some of the following realities. So increased moodiness, depression, really extreme fatigue. Sex can be less enjoyable, and people often gain weight because they start eating again, because they're hungry again. And so if somebody is really trying to reduce or stop their drug use, we gotta let them know that these things might come up. And all of these can really interfere with somebody's ability to stop or reduce their use. Okay, next slide. So there is evidence for these therapeutic approaches. So motivational interviewing, contingency management, community reinforcement approach, and cognitive behavioral therapy specifically for assisting people with stimulant use disorder. However, unlike opioid use disorder, there's not a medication, unfortunately, which makes things easier. However, there are studies going on, and there is some emerging evidence around pharmacotherapy, such as using some ADD medications to help people transition from illicit stimulants. And there are also a lot of people who use illicit stimulants who actually have ADD. I heard a number, I think it was something like 15 to 25% of people who chronically use illicit stimulants do have attention deficit disorder. And then when folks have been using stimulants long-term, it can be really hard for them to convince a doctor to treat them for their ADD. So that's important to consider too. Is somebody using to treat ADD? And even if not, is there some harm reduction practice in prescribing ADD medications to people to help them stay away from illicit and sometimes dangerous stimulants? So next slide. That's it. Thank you all for sticking with me. I don't know if we've got time for questions, comments, concerns, but would love to hear from any of you. And if now is not the time, you've got my email address. You can find us on social media, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody more.
All righty, let's see. Thank you so much, Haley, for giving your time, and this was a great presentation. And thank you, everyone that gave us a little bit of your afternoon to learn a little bit about stimulants. I think maybe, yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat, but yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate having you here. And again, this webinar, it has been recorded and will be available here at crh.arizona.edu. And have a great rest of your Thursday, everyone.